Our next speaker is from Comodo. So the presentation, Hacking the Hackers. Kenneth Geers, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I've spent the last couple of years in Ukraine. Before that was in Estonia. Now in Toronto, but I very much like this part of the world, so I'm so happy to be here at this conference and to see Riga. So my presentation is a little bit about just, again, it's a strategic picture from the encouragement standpoint, also from the intelligence side of things. So there's data, which is random bits, and then there's information, which is kind of organized data, and then there's intelligence, which is, to me anyway, something of political, military, strategic value that you can use for business or military intelligence affairs or cybercrime. So this picture, I don't know if you know this picture, but does anybody know what's strange about this picture? Yes. Perfect. Photoshop from the 1930s, and there's somebody missing in this photo, right? Which is the chief of the NKVD, who is standing next to Stalin and became an unperson after he basically was himself eliminated in the same style of elimination over which he had previously proceeded. So now I'm in the private sector, but I did 20 years in government and associated with a few different think tanks. And basically what I want to say is there's a whole lot you can do in this field. It's green field for you as an analyst, as a coder, as a hacker, basically. And there's going to be all kinds of opportunities for you to see when things are wrong or to develop things that don't exist yet. So this is the book I'm reading now, and it's very exciting, but I think everything in it is happening currently. What happened in the Vietnam War, what's happened in Ukraine, etc., is somewhere in this book, right? So now we're on the edge of cyberspace, or looking toward the future, and I think that power itself is quite different than it used to be. In this book, for example, you have Athens and Sparta, which are two very different powers, one sea, one land. There's a lot of politics in this book. Why do nations fight wars? A very good question. Why did the United States invade Iraq a second time, right? In this book, it explains how there are stated reasons, and then there are the real reasons, and very often these are not even the same. But in cyberspace, I think there is so much opportunity for miscommunication that we should always second guess, let's say, what you read. But there should be plenty of evidence and plenty of support for you as an analyst to get closer to the truth, let's say. And when is it over? War is never really over, and I think that's never more important than today, because the cyber element will definitely precede and come after any conflict. In fact, this is a really big challenge for military commanders today. Let's say you're in charge of a military element and you're preparing for conflict scenarios in the future. You had better be hacking in peacetime, right? Because it's going to be too late once the war starts. So you have a challenge of what's called preparing the battlefield. And today, that's going to look like hacking, and it's going to happen in peacetime, right? And then what international relations professors call the security dilemma comes into play. You're basically going to make all your adversaries very nervous, right, depending on what you're doing. And so this is it's kind of a dangerous time as well, I think, in the national security space. When I came on in the U.S. Department of Defense in 1993, there's probably a few people who were not born yet. But by the end of the 90s, I was doing computer intrusion analysis full-time at the Pentagon, looking at things like, the Chinese hacker problem, for example. How to come to terms with the fact that most of the computers were leaking data. And in 2000, there was this terrorist incident in Yemen. Again, from their perspective, it's a freedom fighter incident, right? But it's an explosion against a U.S. Navy ship, right? So what we did in 2000, 2001 was started looking at this problem of national security where it meets network security and becomes cybersecurity. And this is really interesting because if you're going to protect a ship, and the United States has lots of assets that are pulling into harbors in Goa, India, or Yemen, or Marseille, France, how do you protect the whole thing? There's hardware, software, games that the military service members are playing on the ship. How do you know if they are secure? How do you know what the sailors are saying to other players within the game on the other side of the world? And so there's just many, many things to look at. The cyber cafes at port, for example. And it's become cybersecurity because you don't know what else to call it. Like at the White House, for example, if you want to target the White House and you're a spy, you may well go through family, friends, neighbors, etc. It becomes a real slippery space, the cybersecurity domain, and you don't really know where it starts and where it ends. Today, the latest Navy ships, the latest planes in the US Air Force, they don't have anybody on them, right? These are pilotless drones, swarm ships for the US Navy. So code and the internet play a huge role in the internet already today, but ever more so in the future. You've probably seen the movie Ghost in the Shell from 1995. And if you remember, there's always kind of a big plane flying above Japan in this case. And there's no part in the story where they refer to it, it's just there. And I'm afraid kind of that's where we're going in some sense. But if you look at, for example, Iran in the US military sense, there was a drone that was flying over Iran, evidently piloted from Afghanistan, and evidently they took control of the drone in Iranian airspace and landed it and then put it on TV, right? So if you send something out, you might lose control of it, right? So you have to write code with ethics and legal limits. Like with Stuxnet, for example, they say if you look at the code, it's quite clear that it had a dozen or two lawyers reviewing the code. For example, in the Stuxnet code, there was a point, I think, in which in 2009, there was a drop-dead date in January, just about a week before the new president would come into office, so from Bush to Obama. What does that mean? It means that there was probably already an understanding that the program would need presidential reauthorization, right? So in the code, you can see a kill date of about a week before a change in office in the White House. These are already legal and ethical limits we're placing on code and attacks. I like to quote in this space, there's still a lot of disbelievers, and that's good, in Cyberwar. But if you just look at what militaries say they are doing, you can see that the war is already started. So I just take this is US Army, Field Manual 338, Electromagnetic and Cyber Operations. So these are just some quotes from it, but it says this is a way to apply force, to project power through the networks, in this case US power, and it can be effective up to physical damage, as we've seen with the centrifuges in Iran. And it's not only targeting hardware and software, but people. So already, this is just for the US Army troops, as they read in basic training how to think about cyber. It says not only can you go after the computer, but you can go after the person who is managing the computer, right? So if somebody has a air defense capability, not only can you target the system itself, but you can target the people who are going to be reading that data on the air defense system. So they can perhaps send them an email, right, on their Gmail account, right? And that's also a valid attack vector. In Israel, this is straight from the Israeli Ministry of Defense website on cyberspace operations, and it says that they are relentlessly operating at every front and in all domains, disrupting and thwarting enemy projects, maintaining Israel's qualitative advantage over its adversaries, influencing public opinion both in war and peacetime. Right? So I don't know what more the skeptics want, but right there, Israel is telling you that they are using cyberspace operations not only for military weapon systems, but for public opinion, right? Information operations, information warfare designed to win a war, as Sun Tzu said, before it ever begins. And this is the height of mastery of warcraft. So I spent the past couple of years in Ukraine, and last year I edited a book. We had 20 authors, and we just kind of looked at a wide range of topics assorted into strategy, technical topics, future legal policy. It's a free download from the Cyber Center in Tallinn, Estonia. One of the things I think that's different between 2007 attacks, sort of a blunt force, brute denial of service attack, in Ukraine, basically things have changed, they've evolved. And that's one thing about cyber attacks, is that they will never stay the same, right? As technology evolves, so will not only the quantity, but the quality and the variety of attacks. So everywhere we looked in Ukraine, there was nothing decisive. There was no Hollywood-style attack. But everywhere you looked, you could see examples of attacks. So in the military, there was cutting of cables to sort of sever Crimea from Kiev during the military operations there. The presidential election in Kiev, that was the most sophisticated attack code that the CERT in Kiev analyzed. In diplomacy, you had US diplomats, via signals intelligence, their communications were intercepted. Then they were uploaded to YouTube and announced on Twitter. In infrastructure, we had the famous electricity power attack of Christmas 2015, plus railroads, plus airport. In business, there were smart TVs hacked, e-billboards hacked to display propaganda. And in the social media space, there are accounts that basically are created to spew propaganda and then get thrown away. So a little to the north with Russia, we can see one of the things that if you're an analyst looking at code, you should also be following current events because for me as an analyst, you're also trying to, the attribution problem is real, but you should also try and associate events and attacks with national security requirements of countries. And in the Russian case, there's a long list of, and I think you could do this for many other countries, mind you, of cyber events, incidents that can be associated with Russian political evolution. So in the mid-1980s as well, you've probably read the book The Cuckoo's Egg, right? But that was a case in which the University of California, the system administrator was just trying to find 75 cents that were missing on the network, and subsequently finds that he could trace it all the way back to Moscow, right? And cyber espionage as long ago as the mid-1980s. So I think nation states have been playing this game for a long time. And even at the dawn of the World Wide Web, you can see the war between Moscow and Chechnya for websites, information and control. The Chechens became masters at information war in terms of propaganda versus Moscow, and in return, Moscow became expert in shutting down these websites. In domestic opponents, you can see the same thing. Garry Kasparov's site had a heavy DDoS attack against it before he moved to the West. Today, there is a lot of speculation that there is Russian interest in influencing the US presidential election. And it only makes logical sense, as well as too much of a temptation, right? Especially if one of the candidates is pretty much more pro-Russia position than the other. But it's also interesting, this is kind of the weaponization of WikiLeaks or doxing right? You can destroy a person or a company via doxing. Why not a nation, right? At least for a temporary period of time. In this case, maybe even the NSA itself, right, is a victim of grabbing information and publishing it with a view toward coercing another nation state to do some political changes. So whether or not we think so as little people, whether cyberwar exists and how to deal with it, the political leaders of NATO, basically, they met in Warsaw in July, and they made some fairly broad statements, right? Not only are cyber attacks a clear challenge, but they can be as harmful as conventional attacks. They will be a core task of NATO focus in the future, and they are a domain of operations in the military sphere. So all of this should be very interesting to us because this is a very big space, right? You're talking about all the way from Hawaii to the top of Norway and all the way to the border with Iran, right? This whole space now is a domain of operations for NATO military affairs. This is fascinating and it's revolutionary. And how is the alliance going to be responsible for this space? I think soon we'll probably see some limitations, some voluntary limitations on activities in cyberspace within the alliance. So I'm also involved with the OSCE. And we're trying to develop confidence-building measures in cyberspace, and the OSCE encompasses Russia and Central Asia. And we have a list of 16 now, I think. Basically, they are recommendations. Most of them, all of them have the word voluntary in it, so there's nothing directed about this. But essentially, I think within the alliance, we'll probably see more aggressive activity in terms of limitations on attacks in the financial space, the infrastructure space, and perhaps even limits on cyber espionage, right? Because the difference between cyber attack and cyber exploitation, this is the kind of thing that the US government's been working on for a long time, and I assume other governments too. If you're only, reading the information, then you really don't want it to be called an attack because that's, too aggressive, and that really belongs in the military domain. But if I'm only reading your data, then that's just espionage, and so that's okay, right? Even according to international law, espionage is okay. The problem is, though, is once I'm on your network, I think it's only a few more keystrokes before I can start modifying data, right? And that's clearly attack according to our law. So my guess is if NATO wants to take a step forward in cyber defense, then there will be discussions on how to limit sort of nefarious activities within this particular space, which will be interesting to watch that evolution. Strategic analysis, I think, coming back to the nation level, is about, as Sun Tzu said, it's about first understanding yourself and your place in the universe, and then your adversary, so that you can realistically deal with the threat. And I think there's no other way to move forward but then to invest in IT, mastery, essentially. Because the threats are there, but perhaps they're not as big as we fear they are, and they're not as big perhaps as Hollywood or even national leaders are saying. But how else are you going to know that unless you understand information technology and unless you understand sort of what a cyber attack is and looks like and how to defend against it? So the only way to do that is to really understand this discipline, your place in this new cyberspace, and how to protect yourself and articulate all of this, both for yourself and for others. As a cyber defense researcher, I think there are various categories. There's the lone hacker, there's the collective, and there's the APT. There's a big gap in between them. There's cyber criminals, and that's a little bit of a wild card, but I would think in general the criminals are going to be focused on money. But when it comes to intelligence and preparation of the battlefield, that sort of thing, you should be able to get a feel for what a nation-state attack looks like, if only because APT, I think, is kind of a synonym for bureaucracy, right? This is going to be a threat that has retirement and vacation and bonuses, and it's going to work 24/7. No one person could ever pose that kind of strategic threat. And so if you get the sense that somebody is coming at you over time from different angles and with relatively no fatigue, then you're probably dealing with a bureaucracy somewhere who would like to get inside your network. But on defense, there's a lot you can do, right? So here's a picture of Maidan in 2014 in the main square in Kiev. And the power sort of collaboration among people can be incredible. So one of the differences here, these are not candles or lighters in a concert. It's not a flame. These are cell phones, right? People holding up their cell phones. And this is interesting, both from a targeting perspective and a intelligence collection from the government in this case. So on Maidan, depending on how close you were to the presidential palace, you might get different text messages because the government had sensed a different level of threat. But that's the precision of targeting as well. So governments are probably learning a lot from advertisers. You know, in the future, when you walk through a store, you know, you're going to see an advertisement based on your personal interest and where you are in the store. That's very precise, right? Well, governments will be able to do the same thing. But on defense, I think we have an incredible amount to use and to exploit in the face of any nation-state threat, because essentially you've got friends and colleagues from around the world who are interested in math and science, computers, networks, coding, and that is it just strikes me as more powerful than any one government bureaucracy could be, right? So I think cyberspace ultimately has a lot more in common with democracy and rule of law than it would a dictatorship, right? Not that there's not threats in cyberspace and challenges, as we see from the Donald Trump phenomenon in the United States. But in general, the cyberspace should be a place where, as a researcher, you have access to far more information than even any intelligence analyst within the CIA, for example, who are probably looking at fairly classified, compartmented reports, and what they're missing is the big picture. And that's what you have, is the big picture, and all of us who work sort of in on open source issues. Cybersecurity firms, so I worked for 20 years in the US government, and now I've worked for a couple of firms in cybersecurity. And also, this is very exciting. If you have access to live data, then that's great. So this is my position right now, that I'm one of the, if not the only analyst in a large company. So I'm using Kibana, as we heard about this morning, to sort of look at our first 330 million rows of data. And basically, not only do I have access to a strategic data set, but I can bounce ideas off friends and colleagues that are elsewhere within the cyber defense research space. But cybersecurity firms, I think you're going to see a lot of good and bad perhaps in the reporting, because you're going to have an analyst who might be very smart, but then they're going to have the public relations department in timelines that may be unrealistic for considered analysis. And so, you'll see the difference, right, between, you can actually tell, and I think whether an analyst or a PR guy had written various parts of the report. But there should be a lot of good information, especially if you take it all together. So, you can read some Kaspersky, you can read some Symantec and F-Secure, etc., and you put them together, you're probably going to have a pretty good picture of what's going on in the world, but it's going to take some time to work through it all. Stuxnet is maybe the best case scenario to look at, right? So there is no way that any one researcher or even company would have understood what Stuxnet is or was. It took a huge team of researchers from around the world in many different organizations, specialists in cryptography and in industrial control systems, in computers and exploits and vulnerabilities. But basically, the sum total is a fairly clear picture, I think, of a major headache for national security leaders in the world. And it's logical, again, to find the most sophisticated attack code paired with such a difficult problem. And the problem in this case was a country that wanted to become a member of the nuclear club against the rules, right? There's a whole nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime. So if you have attack code that is that sophisticated, it was probably intended for a very important target and a very important issue. But it was a collaborative space that put this together, and Symantec or Ralph Langner, none of these people could have done it on their own. As you are working, for example, I'll also invoke the name of Bruce Schneier. Bruce is not a rock star or a head of state, and he's the biggest name perhaps in the field. If you send Bruce a question that is on target and is clever and is current, he will answer you. Right? So that's how small our space is and how collaborative I think it usually is. So from a CERT perspective, you also should feel like you're a part of a community that can solve even the world's most difficult problems in this space. Don't be afraid to ever pick up the phone and call and talk to people because I promise you they're probably working on the same issue you are and would love to collaborate and to see what data you have to corroborate. So one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm reading a lot of books on the history of signals intelligence. And I'm very interested in this topic because I was in government, and then as an analyst, I'm supposed to think about the bigger picture. During the Cold War, we had developed this distant early warning line for protection against a nuclear attack, right? And it really was a worldwide thing. And probably a little bit like they're trying to develop for cyberspace. Not only did you have places like this, how would you like to be stationed here in Greenland? When on the photograph you can barely see the institution in which you would be working. But it's a part of a global system of defenses and reconnaissance points and operational sites. The same thing, all of these things have analogies in cyberspace. So I'm actually on the Cyber Command academic team as well in Maryland. And so we're calling it informally the Cyber Analogies Project because half the people are working on the Cyber Pearl Harbor scenario, which I know that generates a lot of smiles. But in fact, I think it's actually not a bad analogy, because the Japanese certainly didn't intend to win World War II at Pearl Harbor. It was just the opening shot, right? And that's probably similar to how cyber attacks would be used in a military scenario. It's not going to be decisive. It's not going to be the end or the permanence of Western civilization, but it will be used to gain time and space, either for a spy or for a cyber criminal or for a nation who is conducting a broader military attack against a particular target. So the same thing when you're doing cyber defense, let's say research analysis, try and draw on points that are analogous to the distant early warning line. Friends, colleagues, different data sets in different places, and pull together a big picture, as with the Stuxnet example. So I see I have exactly 1 minute left, and I'm happy to take any questions either now or this evening. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation and good overview. My name is Mark Val from Belgium. Question to you, a lot, and Bruce has been triggering it as well, a lot's going on in the expert world on security on that there are signs that a group or a nation is trying to bring down the whole internet. What's your opinion on that?
So to bring down the whole internet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. It's one that was posed in the book we did last year on NATO vis-a-vis Russia. Just for theoretical purposes, if, could a nation, in fact, take down parts of the internet? The author analogized to Donbass, actually, in Ukraine, in shutting down either part of the internet or all of the internet in terms of extortion, or it's like ransomware. If you're a company and all of a sudden everything is encrypted, what are you going to do? And Heartbleed, for example, it gives you a sense of the scale of maybe some exploits that could target vast portions of networks. This is a good question. I don't know. And that's one of the reasons I think the Estonia 2007 case is kind of a good example. It wasn't the biggest or worst cyber attack ever, but if your government is sort of putting all of its investments into e-governance and digital society, well, what happens if it doesn't work all of a sudden? And that's Estonia, I think, is so one of the things they're doing is they're backing up their whole country in England, right? There are, contingency plans, but as we heard this morning, often the tape backups are still connected to the network, or there's not an understanding of how one analyst could encrypt 500,000 files because they just have those permissions. So there's serious threats, and what do you do if the network goes down? And that's the US Navy, for example, in the Pacific, often practices warfare without the internet, because they assume that if there were war with Taiwan, the first thing China would do is turn off the internet, right, in order to blind the US Navy to intelligence and a understanding of what's happening in the field of battle.
A short question. So for some time we thought that these doomsday scenarios where we would really be cut off the world are not fashionable anymore, that now people are going for more sophisticated things. But from what I hear now is that it could become again something we should be prepared for. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I guess it just depends on the situation. So the chapter in the book was, well, what if Putin were sort of in a corner? Is it possible that Russia could threaten to take down portions of the internet? And I guess the same is true for anarchist groups, perhaps, who might have access to really great hackers. It's just unknown. But I think that the China example, and also in the Middle East, I think there are, if you want to see live attacks, sort of the Arab-Israeli conflict is always full of them. Every time there is an Israeli invasion of Gaza or artillery across the Lebanese border, there will be simultaneous defacements and denial of service attacks in the region, but specifically against Israeli economy, right? So one of the things that let's say Palestinian hackers do is target the Israeli economy. And so there's a sense in cyberspace that you can be asymmetric, but you can also attack different things, right? The laws of war say that you should have discretion, which is only hit military targets, and that's probably off the table in the future because the whole telecommunications infrastructure is mostly civilian, and that's carrying all of the classified data as well. So the Pentagon and militaries and intelligence agencies are essentially, we're all in the same cyberspace, on the same network now. That means students, soldiers, and spies are all sort of coexisting in this space. what the future looks like is anybody's guess, I think. And you don't have to be proportional either. Also, according to the laws of war, your attack should be proportional to the attack you have received if you're counterattacking or in self-defense. But cyberspace gives you the opportunity to hit somewhere else. So, like in 1982, for example, the war over the Falkland Islands, the UK actually sent ships down to defend the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. But the Argentina didn't have any kind of way to defend against that type of military hardware. But in cyberspace, you could imagine now they would have perhaps another means of waging warfare, which would be digital.
Thank you. So